Hello, this is part 9 of our game making tutorial. Last time we made it so that weapons were a thing you could pick up. So we made like a machine gun, machine gun object, such as it is. I'm probably going to rename this at some point. And now you start with no weapon, you've got to pick it up, then once you do pick it up, it can fire. And part of the point of that is now all the code for firing is on the gun itself, and we can make more guns, and we can have them have different functions. So clicking right now does nothing, but clicking now fires. And that's about as far as we got. So the first thing we should do is make a new weapon, I think. Let's duplicate it and let's make one that just fires one shot at a time. We could do it on a timer, couldn't we? Yeah, let's do a bit of both. So we'll just call it like single shotgun. I'm wincing because these are not really guns, they're probably going to be more like organic parts or something, but for reference we at least won't forget what that is. Keep this going. Yep. Let's give it, it'll need this owner thing like normal, like the other gun, but let's also give it a time between shots, so seconds between shots equals, I don't think we'll make it very big, I think we'll make it like, so that you can fire 5 times a second with that. And then we'll say seconds since last shot equals 0. And hopefully I'll remember what I wrote there. Then the step event, right now it's set up just like the other one. Eventually we'll put some of this stuff into functions, into scripts, so that we can just call it, we don't have this copy and pasted code. But this bit we actually do want to behave differently. And so we want to say only if sorry, I'll type and, slightly more readable way of doing it. Left mouse button is pressed, and seconds since last shot is greater than or equal to seconds between shots. Then we fire, and we'll take seconds since last shot, obviously we should be reset at that point. And before we do that, seconds since last shot should equal seconds since last shot plus 1 over room speed. In other words, that just increases with time. That counts the number of seconds. And how much do you want to increase it by? We want to increase it by 1 per second. And that's what divided by room speed means, per second. I know I said that many times before, but it just looks weird, so I feel the need to explain it. Let's actually comment that. Increment timer. And if we're clicking and we're ready to fire, seconds since last shot is greater than or equal to seconds between shots. And that one increments it, this one resets it. That all should be good. Is there anything else we want to change here? Basically, we're going to place this in the level and it will be in a different place, and if we pick this up, this will be our weapon instead of the other one. The only question is, while we're at it, let's make it go really fast as well. So we'll increase the speed to 1,000. Let's increase the kick to 1,000 as well, and leave the rest as is. I might just. It looks literally identical to our other one, so we could just quickly duplicate this one, open it up, and we'll just mirror it. So at least you can tell that it's different, and then actually apply that sprite. Oh, I didn't give it a name. Let's call it S gun. That's the wrong name, but it doesn't matter for now because I'm going to replace it soon enough. So now I need to place it in the room, obviously, before we test, so that we can actually know where to pick it up. S single shotgun, we'll put it near us up there. And now, if we pick that one up, we should have a single shot weapon. Be interesting. Is this one right? No, can't be picked up, and I know why. Because our player pickup code, good lord, what the hell is going on there? I just opened an empty create event and then it asked me to save it. This thing is only looking for the machine gun object. And we could change that to look for like a parent gun object and create that. But actually I think we want the code to be on the weapons really. So we'll delete all that. The player is not going to decide when to pick that weapon up. The weapon will decide. So that they're only checking for one object, they're just checking for the player. So let's insert a script here. It's going to collapse all my scripts for some reason. And call it can be picked up. And in there we're going to say we actually, in this case, we don't need to store the name of the player because we're going to check against the player object. There's only one of them, so we can actually say if you want this to be, I guess, yeah, let's just stick with what we know. So if instance exists, instance place XYO player. So that bit checks whether something exists, and this bit returns the identity of something if it found one. If it didn't, it returns no one, and no one doesn't exist. No one doesn't exist. That's actually what I meant to say. That wasn't a slip of the tongue. That's literally how it works. No one doesn't exist, and so it will fail. There is a simpler way of doing that, but we'll stick to what we know for now. And if that happens, then we want, well, first of all, let's say owner equals O player, and then let's say owner.current weapon equals self.id. I'm reversing all this. And that's it, isn't it? We want we want to remember that we have an owner now, and we want our owner, who is the player, to set their current weapon to us. That should be it. Let's make this, let's put everything we need in here. So we actually want to check, do we have an owner already? If instance exists, owner equals false, then we do all that. And that just means we can use the script anyway now. We don't have to remember to nest it within the right if statement. So now if we go to our weapons, go to our machine gun first, open up a step event. Previously, yeah, we can just put this down here. So that if statement says if instance exists owner, so technically this will only happen in the else of that, but we don't want to depend on that, so we might want to restructure that. We might want to change what that if statement says. Let's, wherever possible, let's make our scripts self-sufficient, and then we don't have to worry about them. I'm going to do that with single shotgun as well. This looks way cleaner and easier than my code normally does, so I'm suspicious. I've probably got something wrong here. Hey, it picked it up. And look, we can fire! We've now got a sort of quite rapid fire single shot weapon with a lot of kick per shot, but less rapid shots. Now, what happens if we pick this one up? Oh, I think we're doing both, aren't we? Because there's an inconsistency in it. Oh my god, we died and left our twin guns behind. Oh no, they're obscuring both our eyes. Okay, I should fix. It looks hilarious, but let's fix it now. Right, sorry, I'm cutting in here because what I did there was, in trying to solve that depth problem, I tried to do it the proper way, the way I'm doing it with heat signature, and it sent me down a rabbit hole that involved completely restructuring the game. At the end of it, it didn't actually work that well, and so I realised that was just a bad way to teach that thing. So we want to fix depth, and we're going to do it the cheap and dirty way. That's not that great in the long run, but yeah, we want these guns to appear behind the player instead of in front of the player. That means setting their depth value. That's a special reserved word in GameMaker. And the higher your depth is, try and speak more clearly, the further back it is. So the lowest depths are towards the player, and the highest depths are towards the back. And that makes sense with the word depth, right? The deeper you are into the screen, the further away you are from the player. So all we need is for the gun's depth to be higher than the player's. So I'm just going to say, this is a really cheap hacky way of doing it, I'm just going to say depth 10 for that. This is a short-term fix, a band-aid fix. ideally what I'd like to do is do a whole list of have a central place where we put all the depths, like we have a global variable for each depth, like a gun depth, a player depth, an enemy depth, and then all these objects would all refer to that to find out what their depth is, and then we could reorder them easily. As an exercise for yourself, you could figure out how to do that, because it's harder than it sounds. The question is like where you put that list, because you want these things to get their depth when they're created, and you don't necessarily control the order in which instances are created in GameMaker. Or you can, I think now in GameMaker Studio you can, but I haven't done it, and I think it's complicated, and every time you add something you probably have to reshuffle it or whatever. So we're not going to bother that. We're going to do it the cheap and easy way and save about 20 minutes of your life. Which actually, when you say it like that, isn't that much. But to be honest, the player's depth is already 0, so let's just not even put something there. If you want to do, you could say depth equals something here, but it's this thing's depth is 0, gun's depth is 10, and that means they'll go behind it. Could set their depth to 1, but then it means you can't put anything between them. This is how I did it in Gunpoint, and I did regret it eventually. Like, at the end of a 3-year project, all your depths where you thought, oh, let's just make this one like 2048, so it's really high, and then you need something else that's higher than that, and then you need something else that's less. It's a mess. The one particular reason I wanted to fix that was, I don't really care which way around it goes, whether the guns are in front of the player or whether the guns are behind, because we can adjust the art either way. I'm not fussed about which way around we have it. But what we saw there was that when we first picked up the gun, it was behind us, and then when we respawned, it was in front of us. And that's because they had the same depth, so GameMaker has no idea which one should go in front of the other. And so it ends up doing it by the order in which they were created. So initially the player was created first, so it was in front, and then later on, when the player dies and respawns, then the player is more recently created than the guns. I don't know why I explained that, that's not important, you don't need to know that. Just don't set things to the same depth. That's what the whole point of what I just showed you. So, we've got 2 guns. The problem is when we pick up both, we fire both at once. We don't want that. We want to be able to switch between them. And so, we should set up an array. I'm excited about this because arrays are cool. So, the way we should do this, we're going to need a create event for the player. It's remarkable that we don't already have one. And in that create event, we want to set up a couple of things. The way I'll show you what an array looks like. I'll just type some stuff that shows you what an array looks like. So we're probably going to make an array of weapons. So it's a variable like any other, but you can put a number after it. So you can do weapon 0. We could do weapon 0 equals a machine gun. We won't do this because we don't want to manually set all the stuff up. We want it to be formed dynamically when we run the game. But to explain how they work, we could do something like this. Single shot gun, I forgot the equals. And let's even imagine we had a third gun and we could say like equals shotgun. That's an array. And they all have the same variable name, but they have a different index. That number in the brackets here is the index. And they, as generally true with programming stuff, they start at 0. And the advantage of it is, if we wanted to switch between these 3 things, we could make a button that says, if, I'll just say button pressed for now, then, well, first of all we could say that what we want to, that we want the player to use a particular one, so we'd have a thing that's like selected weapon index equals 0 initially, and then if there's a certain button are pressed, it might be right mouse, we could say selected weapon index equals selected weapon index plus 1, and then it would switch to the next weapon in that array. So if it's 0 initially, press this button, it would switch to 1, and then press the button again, it would switch to 2. And of course, if we press it the third time, it will switch to 3, and our game will crash because there is no weapon 3. So you have to be aware of that with arrays. Accessing an index of an array that you haven't defined is just like accessing a variable you haven't defined. You haven't told it what that should be, so the game doesn't know what to do when it crashes. By the way, it's not that there's no way to make a development environment that wouldn't crash. GameMaker wants to crash then. It wants to stop you because you've asked it to do something without saying what you want to happen. And so it's crashing to do you a favour. It's saying, look, you haven't defined how this should work. I could bluff it, I could make it up, I could say this thing is 0, and there used to be an option for that. But what you find in the long run is that if you don't know that these things aren't defined, then your game just starts behaving weirdly and you don't understand why. So that's just a note about crashes. When, at the end user, if you're just a gamer and you're playing games that have been sold for money and it crashes, that's a bad thing and it wasn't supposed to happen, and obviously the developer wants to minimize those crashes. In GameMaker, they're not trying to minimize the number of times the editor crashes. If you write code that doesn't specify what should happen, they want it to crash so that you know you've written code that breaks that way. So, this is roughly what our thing is going to look like. We won't put all this in one big chunk like this. What we'll really do is start with no weapons, and then when you pick one up, we'll add it to the array. So yeah, one advantage of that is that we can cycle through weapons like that. And the cool thing about it is that it means we could keep creating these weapon objects all the time, and we never have to go back to the player and say, oh, you should understand now that there's such a thing as a shotgun. We don't have to write that word in there. We won't have this. This will be happening when you pick them up. So the player doesn't need to know how many weapons there are in the world, and that means every time we add a weapon, there's less work to do. We just get to create a new weapon object, we tell it all its properties, and that knows everything it needs to know about it itself. So let's actually start with this. Initially, we don't need to define any weapons, because the player won't have one. I think we'll say the main thing we'll need is... Okay, so actually, I'll explain what this variable will be before we write it. So I just said here that if we were at 2 and we added 1, we'd crash because there's no such... as soon as we referred to weapon with the selected weapon index, which is the one we want to use, it would crash because what we're really saying there is weapon 3, and there is no weapon 3. So here we would want to say, I'll write it the awkward way, I know there's a quick way of doing this, but we want to just be able to read and understand the code. If selected weapon index is greater than or equal to weapon count, then we want to go back to 0. Selected weapon index equals 0. I'll put that in a new line just to make it clear what we've written. And so we need this weapon count variable. We want to make sure we know what the maximum is. So here we've defined up to 2. We would want to make a note that weapon count is 3. There are actually 3 weapons here in total, aren't there? And so the last valid one is 2. That means we don't ever want to say 3, and that's why we say if the selected weapon index is greater than or equal to weapon count, in this case if it's equal to 3 or more than 3, then we want to loop back to 0. So, weapon count is the first thing we need, and initially it's going to be 0, and that tells us, here if it's 3 it tells us not to go beyond 2, if it's 0 it tells us not to even access the array at all. None of them have been defined, none of this exists. This is all just to illustrate things. None of this is actual code we're going to use. So when the player starts, all he knows is I don't have any weapons. Weapon count is 0, so nothing's going to happen with weapons. Then, in fact, I'll just delete all this. Shall I do it? I'll cut it in case we do need it. So on startup, weapon count equals 0. I think that's what we need to define at startup. And then the thing we want to do is, actually we put the pickup code on the weapons, didn't we? Right? Yeah. Is there a problem with this? It had a little exclam down the bottom. So this code is to pick up weapons. Now, right now, it sets the owner.currentWeapon to ourselves. And that is no good if you already have a weapon, because now we're replacing it, and there's no way for the player to access the other weapon. And when we check to see whether we should fire, all we check is do we have an owner. We don't check whether the player selected us as their weapon. All we check is just that someone owns us at all. So therefore, when they click, they must want to fire us. And that's wrong. We don't want all the weapons to fire every time you click. We want to actually check. So, when the player picks us up, instead of current weapon, we want to add to his weapon array. So, remember that this weapon array hasn't been defined at all. None of these are defined yet, if you haven't picked up any weapons. And we want to define the 0 element. We want weapon 0 to be, this is if we're the first weapon for the player to pick up. We want the first element, which is 0, to be us. But obviously we don't want to assume that we're the first weapon that he's picked up. He might already have one. So how do we get that 0 value? How do we get a value that's 0 before we picked up any weapons, and 1 after we picked up 1 weapon, and 2 after we picked up 2 weapons? Well, that's weapon count, isn't it? It says pasting a apocalyptic mess of stuff that's nothing to do with what I just said. Let's just type the word weapon count. So weapon with weapon count in brackets. When we have 0 weapons, that is weapon 0. That's what we want. When we have 1 weapon, that's going to be weapon 1, and that means that's the second slot. I know that's confusing. I I would say we could just do it with 1 as being the first one, but I think that's going to get us in more trouble than we want to get into. This is one of those counterintuitive things that it's worth just learning, it's just worth wrapping your head around it and doing it the dumb way that programmers do, because programmers really do it this way. They always do it this way, and every piece of code anyone ever shows you will assume you're doing it this way, and so if you don't, it's horrible. You can't learn from anyone else's stuff. It's like speaking the language. You just have to learn to count from 0. In a way, it ends up being sort of intuitive because we have this weapon count thing, and the weapon count, that number really will be the number of weapons we own. So right here, we own 0 weapons, we're setting that one, and when we pick up the next one, we want to make sure that weapon count is increased by 1. Another thing we should be careful of actually is it's not our weapon count, it's the owner's weapon count. The owner being the player. And then we want to say owner.weapon count equals owner.weapon count plus 1. You may already know there's a quicker way to add 1 to a value, but we're going to stick with the old way for now, just to avoid piling on too much new terminology and syntax and stuff. So to recap, I'm going to comment this as we go. Remember who owns us. Our owner is the player. Add us to our new owner's weapon array. We'll add a comment here to say weapon count will always be... actually no, this is self-explanatory. Weapon count is the number of weapons you have. That's what it is. And then we'll say tell our owner that they have 1 more weapon than before. We're increasing their weapon count. They have 1 more weapon, so we want that to go up. And this is how I add to arrays in heat signature all the time. We use this weapon count or count thing. I just always add the word count to whatever the name of the array is. And it tells you where to slot the new thing in, and then you increment it, and next time the new one will slot into a new thing. So that's all good for picking up, and because we made that into a script, that's already corrected on both our machine gun and our single shotgun. The next thing we need to fix is that when we check whether we should fire, all we check is that we have an owner. And both guns, once we pick them up, they'll both have an owner, but only one of them will be our selected gun. So all this is correct. If we have an owner, we want to follow them, we want to face the way they're looking, regardless of whether they selected us or not. We don't want to be left behind on the ground when the owner walks away. But for the firing thing, we should say, in fact, we'll keep it within we both need an owner and we need to be their selected weapon. So if owner.weapon, do you remember we did the selected weapon index? That's going to be the variable that keeps track of just what number weapon we're selecting. So it could be 0, it could be 1. In this case, we're only going to have 0 and 1 at most because we've only got 2 weapons. And we want to check, is that us? Is that equal to self.id? Self always refers to us. Usually you don't need it if you want to say, like, in fact, I wonder what happens if you just write ID. I bet that works, but we're not going to check it because it's one more thing that could go wrong. I've been typing self.id for years and I might be completely unnecessary. So if our owner's selected weapon is us, then we want to check if they're pressing the mouse button and if they're firing. The reason we put all of this within this other if statement is that if we don't have an owner and we check for the owner's weapon, then it will crash because it does, like, if our owner doesn't exist, then accessing its weapon property is accessing an undefined thing. And again, GameMaker wants to crash when you access something that you haven't defined because it wants to tell you, you haven't told me what to do in this situation. So this we will have to change on both guns. We may later realise that there's a way to make a script out of this and to make it universal. It's not a huge deal if you are just managing 2 different objects and you find yourself repeating a bit of code, because in general, the best way, the most efficient way to format some code is only clear to you after you've written the code. So I feel quite confident saying that because that's my instinct, but also it's pretty much what Jonathan Blow and I think Casey Muratori as well have both said in their own thoughts and posts on programming. They are Jonathan Blow made Braid, and he and Casey are both working on the Witness right now, and they're both extremely experienced programmers who can talk with great authority and experience about programming. And actually, I really recommend Casey's blog and Jonathan Blow on Twitter, because he talks about programming all the time. And Casey right now is doing something quite similar to what we're doing, but the hardcore version. He's making his own game engine from scratch in C, which is a much more difficult language than this, much more programmery language, and he's showing you how to build it all completely from the ground up. And he's doing I think it's 2 hours a day. He's live streaming the entire thing, and he's building an engine where, as you're writing the code, you can be seeing the game running in the background, and the game can be playing itself for you based on recorded input from when you last played it. And it's fucking hell. That was before he had a player moving around on the screen. It's put that in to show that feature. So we are doing almost the opposite. It's a similar thing, but we are completely geared towards getting shit on screen and getting it moving around and getting something fun to happen. And all the technology, as much as possible, we want someone else to do that for us, so that it's nice and easy to learn. So, have we written this correctly? We put it all within the owner statement. We want to move around with the owner if we have one, and then if their selected weapon index, their selected weapon essentially, is us, then we want to fire. That all looks correct. So the only we already create the player's weapon array and manage his weapon count with this can be picked up script. Go back in here to remind you. All that is messing with our player's weapon array and his weapon count. So that is managed for him. The only thing he has to do is manage the selected weapon index, because we don't want to, as the gun, we don't have the right to tell him which weapon he's selecting. He should be the one to decide that. So I'm going to stop correcting myself to he or she. We're just going to say this is a male protagonist, because just for brevity. It's just going to take much longer if I keep correcting myself. And maybe at the end we'll decide it's a female protagonist and we'll just change it. So now we want a whole new section for weapon switching. And I said earlier we might do it for the right mouse button. So we'll say if mouse check button pressed, brackets, MB right, then we want to switch weapons. I'm just realising now we will have to give selected weapon index an initial value, because when we change weapon, as in my example, we change based on what our current weapon index is. So, in fact, I wish I hadn't just copied that, because the one time I do need all that code I cut right at the start is now. But let's just write it out, because we understand what this is, right? We understand that if selected weapon index equals weapon count, then selected weapon index should go to 0 instead. And we'll say greater than or equal to. In the current code, there's no way it could possibly be greater than, because we're only adding 1 each time. And we know that last time we did this, we wouldn't have increased it past weapon count, or wouldn't increase it to weapon count without resetting it. But there's no advantage to making assumptions. If we ever did go beyond it, we would want to reduce it for sure. So we might as well leave that greater than in there. And I'll annotate this. Switch to the next weapon up. We'll say, oh my god, okay. And if we've gone too far, loop back. I'll show you the more efficient way of doing this in a minute, because it is useful in general, but we'll do it the way we already understand how to right now. So the last thing to do is this selected weapon index equals 0. Let's have that. Let's have that initially. So we don't set up the array itself here, we just set up some things that are going to be useful for it, the maximum number of elements and the current selected element. And hopefully all this should work. Right, let's pick one up. Nope, crashed. Oh, come on, we had selected weapon index. Oh, no, sorry. Okay. Do you see what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that is I'm an idiot. I made the exact mistake I warned you about, which was you have to keep remembering that you're not talking about your own variable, you're talking about the owner's variable here. And we'll probably have to do that in both places. I bet I made the same mistake twice. Yep. It's tricky, like, because you're already talking about an owner variable, you're thinking in owner terms, or at least I am, and that's one of my flaws. Okay, it's promising. Yeah, look, we're firing that one. Now pick up the next one, and we're still firing the old one. If I press the right mouse button, we're firing the new one! Fantastic. Really, I shouldn't be this delighted when something works at this level, because this is like, I'm trying to teach you the basics. We're trying to go over stuff I should know really, really well. But to be honest, like, I don't know if this is true for more experienced coders, probably not, but I get basic stuff wrong all the time. Most of the bugs and stuff that happen in heat signature, I'm doing some quite advanced stuff, at least for me, but the stuff that breaks is just, oh, I forgot to add owner dot before that variable name, or I forgot to define this before it actually gets called. And often it's stuff that I know I should do, I just forgot, because I have literally 100 other things on my mind. Programming will always test the capacity of your brain to think about multiple things at once and keep things in mind and not be forgetful. But the good news is, you can be forgetful and scatterbrained like me, and still program, because it will tell you what's wrong generally. You know how to speak the language. At least GameMaker will. Actually, I don't know what it's like for other programming languages. So we have a working array. That's pretty cool.